The petition for a competency hearing arrived at his door 3 days after the will was read. His own children, who hadn't visited in 3 years, were now asking a judge to declare their father mentally unfit, all because he left his entire $3 million estate to the 16-year-old boy next door. His name was Arthur Bell, a 74-year-old widower worth over $3 million who lived in a simple ranch house and drank his coffee from the same chipped mug for 20 years. For 3 years, while his own son and daughter remained distant voices on a silent phone, it was the teenager from next door who showed up. This raises the single question that would consume a courtroom. Was this a final act of gratitude or the ultimate proof of a mind deceived? To understand the battle over Arthur Bell's mind, you have to understand the silence that defined his life after his wife, Elena, passed. For 2 years, the big house on Maple Crest Lane was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional ringing of a phone that his children rarely answered. Arthur had been a successful, if unassuming, mechanical engineer. He and Elena built their wealth not through extravagance, but through decades of prudent saving and smart investments in the tech boom of the 90s. When she died of a sudden stroke, something in Arthur's world simply stopped moving. His son Mark lived a 4-hour flight away in Seattle, climbing the ladder at a major software firm. His daughter, Diane, was only 40 minutes away in the city, but was consumed by her dual careers as a real estate agent and a mother to twin toddlers. The calls, initially weekly, stretched to bi-weekly, then became brief, dutiful check-ins on birthdays and holidays. Arthur would ask about the grandkids, hear the distracted sounds of a busy household in the background, and hang up feeling lonelier than before he dialed. The first interaction with Leo wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday in late May. Arthur, then 71, was struggling to drag his recycling bin back up the driveway. The wheel had caught. Leo Martinez, 15 at the time, was shooting hoops in his own driveway next door. He saw the older man pause, put a hand to his lower back. Without a word, Leo jogged over, grabbed the bin's handle, and pulled it smoothly to the garage. "All set, Mr. Bell," he said. Arthur offered him $20. Leo shook his head. "It's nothing," he said. A week later, Leo was back, asking if Arthur needed his lawn mowed. His mower was broken, he explained, and he was saving for a car. Could he mow Arthur for a fair price? Arthur agreed. What started as a transaction became a ritual. Every Saturday morning, Leo would appear. He didn't just mow, he edged, he weeded the flower beds Elena had planted, and he'd leave the clippings bagged neatly by the curb. One Saturday, he noticed Arthur's newspaper was still in the driveway from the day before. He brought it to the door. Arthur, feeling a pang of embarrassment, confessed his arthritis made the walk difficult on damp mornings. The next day, and every day after, the paper appeared on Arthur's porch by 7 a.m. The relationship deepened in the autumn of that first year. Arthur had a minor fender bender, and his doctor suggested he stop driving at night until his cataract surgery was completed. He mentioned it offhand to Leo one afternoon. "Where do you need to go?" Leo asked. And so began the drives, to the grocery store on Tuesdays, to the pharmacy on Fridays, to doctor's appointments, where Leo would wait in the lobby, earbuds in, never complaining. Arthur would try to pay him for gas and time. Leo would accept only for the gas. For Arthur, this wasn't just help, it was companionship. Leo would talk about school, about his hopes to study engineering, a fact that made Arthur's eyes light up. He began lending Leo old textbooks, explaining concepts over the kitchen table. In Leo, Arthur saw a curiosity, a quiet diligence that reminded him of his younger self. In Arthur, Leo found a patient listener, a man who didn't talk down to him, who valued his time and his thoughts. Meanwhile, the silence from his own children grew more profound. Mark cancelled his planned visit for Thanksgiving, citing a critical project deadline. Diane's calls became voicemails left while Arthur was napping. "Hey Dad, just thinking of you. Crazy day. Call you later." Later rarely came. When Arthur suffered a mild but frightening transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, while home alone, it was Leo who found him, disoriented, trying to dial the phone. It was Leo who called 911 and rode in the ambulance, holding the old man's hand. At the hospital, when Arthur was stabilized, a social worker gently asked for an emergency contact. Arthur gave her Diane's number. Diane arrived 3 hours later, frazzled, the twins with a sitter. She was concerned, yes, but her questions to the doctors were laced with a practical cold anxiety. What level of care will he need? Is this dementia? She stayed for 40 minutes, promised to check in, and left. Mark sent a large, get well soon fruit basket from a corporate gift service. The card was pre-printed. Arthur was discharged with a referral for in-home health aides. Diane Research Services, but the costs were staggering. Almost casually, Leo's mother, Maria, a nurse's aide herself, offered a solution. Leo could stop by after school each day for a wellness check, make sure Arthur took his medication, help with a simple meal, just be there. For a modest, fixed weekly sum far less than an agency would charge. It was a lifeline. Arthur agreed. This was the pattern for 3 years. Leo became a fixture. He had a key. He knew Arthur's medication schedule, his favorite brand of soup, how he took his tea. He drove him to every follow-up appointment. He helped him set up a video call so he could see Mark's kids on Christmas morning. Arthur, in turn, helped Leo with calculus homework, wrote a glowing letter of recommendation for his college applications, and became his most steadfast cheerleader. The financial arrangement was always clear, always documented with simple receipts Leo's mother helped him write, but the emotional currency was immeasurable. Arthur began to speak of Leo not as a helper, but as the kid, with a warmth in his voice that had been absent for years. He told his barber, his retired friend at the diner, about Leo's latest achievement. His own children, when they called, heard these stories as anecdotes, not alarms. They were relieved, they would later claim. Relieved that Dad had found reliable help, so they didn't have to worry. But here is where the story fractures, and where the lawyers would later pick it apart. Was this the natural, beautiful flowering of a surrogate grandparent bond? Or was it, as Arthur's children would allege, the calculated first steps of a scheme? Because the research is stark. Isolation is the classic tool of undue influence, and without anyone realizing it, Arthur Bell was becoming isolated from everyone except the teenager next door. His old friends passed away or moved to assisted living. His children were digitally present, but physically absent. Leo and his mother, Maria, were the only consistent, physical presence in his world. The turning point, the event that set the final act in motion, was a bright Tuesday in April. Arthur had his quarterly meeting with his financial advisor. The statement showed his holdings, conservatively managed, were worth just over $3.2 million. That evening, Leo drove him to his longtime lawyer's office for a routine update to his power of attorney documents. In the car, Arthur was quiet. He looked out at the streets he'd driven with Alina for 50 years. He finally spoke, not to Leo, but almost to himself. You know, they think this is all about the money. They don't understand it's about the time. It's about who shows up for the time. He walked into the lawyer's office alone, but when he sat down, he gave instructions that would detonate his family. He wanted a new will drafted. He wanted to leave everything, the house, the investments, the entire estate, to Leonardo Martinez. His children, Mark and Diane, were to receive $1 each, a symbolic disinheritance. His reason, stated plainly to his attorney, was simple. Leo has been my son in practice when my own were not. He has earned this. The attorney, bound by duty but also by professional caution, asked Arthur a series of pointed questions. Did anyone pressure him? Was he aware of the consequences? Did he understand he was disinheriting his natural heirs? Arthur answered each one with calm, lucid clarity. He signed the documents. The will was witnessed, notarized, and filed. Arthur Bell walked out, called Leo for a pickup, and went home to his quiet house. He told no one. He simply waited, a man who had, in his mind, finally balanced the scales of loyalty and love. He didn't have to wait long. 6 weeks later, Arthur Bell passed away peacefully in his sleep. The cause was heart failure. He was 74, and when the family gathered in the lawyer's wood-paneled conference room to hear the last will and testament of Arthur Bell, the explosion was instantaneous. Mark's face went from grief to white-hot rage. Diane sobbed, not in mourning, but in utter betrayal. They demanded to know who this Leonardo Martinez was. And when the lawyer explained it was the teenage boy from next door, the boy they'd vaguely known cut their father's grass, their disbelief curdled into a single, unified conviction. Their father, they declared, had been manipulated. He had been isolated, his mind preyed upon in his vulnerable, grieving state. This was not his true will. This was the product of undue influence. They instructed their own attorneys to file a petition. They were not contesting the will. They were contesting their father's very capacity to have made it. They were asking a probate judge to declare Arthur Bell mentally incompetent at the time of signing, to nullify the document, and to hand his life's work back to the blood he had chosen to forget. The legal papers were served to Leo Martinez, now 18 and a freshman in college, on a bright Monday morning. They contained a phrase that would become the battlefield: a competency hearing. For Leo Martinez, a college freshman navigating calculus and dorm life, the legal summons was a message from a world he didn't understand. It accused him, in dense legalese, of exercising undue influence over a vulnerable elder. It demanded he appear in probate court to defend not just the inheritance, but his own character. His mother, Maria, a woman who had cleaned houses and cared for the elderly her whole life, read the document and began to cry. Not out of greed for money they'd never expected, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the accusation. They had helped a lonely old man. Now they were being painted as predators. On the other side, Mark and Diane Bell were marshalling their resources. Their grief had been instantly subsumed by a furious sense of injustice. To them, the will wasn't just unfair, it was medically impossible. Their father, they told anyone who would listen, had not been himself since their mother died. He was grieving, he was physically frail, and he was undoubtedly suffering from cognitive decline. How else could he cut out his own flesh and blood? They hired a formidable law firm specializing in probate litigation and elder law. Their strategy was two-pronged. First, prove Arthur Bell lacked testamentary capacity, the legal mental standard to make a will. Second, and more damningly, prove a pattern of isolation and manipulation by the Martinez family. The legal battlefield was probate court, a realm of quiet procedure that now crackled with animosity. The judge assigned was the Honorable Margaret Voss, known for a no-nonsense demeanor and a deep skepticism of last-minute deathbed changes to estates. Her first order was to appoint a neutral third party, a court investigator, to pore over Arthur Bell's life. This investigator would interview everyone, examine medical records, bank statements, and phone logs, and deliver a report that would heavily influence the hearing. The discovery process began, and with it, the war of narratives. Mark and Diane's attorneys subpoenaed everything. They requested all of Arthur's medical records from the past decade. They demanded every receipt, every bank transfer, every email and text message between Arthur and Leo or Maria. They sought records from Leo's college application to see if Arthur had written his recommendation letter asterisk after drafting the new will, implying a quid pro quo. Leo's court-appointed attorney, a weary but shrewd litigator named Ben Cruz, fought back. He requested all communication between Arthur and his children for the past 5 years. He subpoenaed Mark and Diane's financial records, looking for evidence of debt or a pressing need for the inheritance that might motivate their challenge. He sought testimony from Arthur's longtime friends, his doctor, his barber, anyone who could speak to his state of mind. What emerged from this paper trail was a portrait in stark, conflicting contrasts. The children's case built its foundation on medical vulnerability. Arthur's records showed the mini-stroke, the diagnosed arthritis, the cataracts, and prescriptions for mild anxiety and sleep aids following his wife's death. A geriatric psychiatrist, retained by their legal team, reviewed the files and wrote a report stating that Arthur exhibited classic signs of progressive cognitive vulnerability and was at high risk for undue influence due to social isolation and physical dependence. They highlighted a single, potentially crucial note from a routine checkup 8 months before his death, where the doctor had scribbled, "Patient seems slightly more forgetful, Ray. Medication times. Monitor." Their most emotional ammunition came from phone records. They produced logs showing they called their father, or attempted to. Dozens of calls, they argued, that often went unanswered or were cut short. They interpreted this not as their father's reluctance, but as evidence of the Martinez family's gatekeeping. Diane gave a tearful deposition describing how she'd call and sometimes Leo would answer, saying Mr. Bell was resting or was out with him. "We were being blocked from our own father," she claimed. But Ben Cruz, for Leo, was building a very different picture. He started with the medical evidence. Yes, there was a note about forgetfulness, but the same doctor, in his full deposition, stated unequivocally that Arthur Bell scored perfectly normal on his annual cognitive screenings, known as mini-mental state exams. He was deemed fully capable of managing his own finances and healthcare decisions up until his death. The mini-stroke had left no lasting cognitive impairment. The forgetfulness was never formally diagnosed as dementia. Then Cruz presented the communication records. The phone logs showed a brutal, one-sided truth. While Mark and Diane's calls were sporadic, the duration was telling. Their average call with their father lasted less than 4 minutes. Dozens of calls, yes, but hundreds of minutes of silence between them. In stark contrast, the records from Arthur's landline, which he used to call Leo's cell phone, showed frequent, often lengthy calls, sometimes daily. They weren't just logistical. They were conversations. The financial records were perhaps the most decisive. Cruz laid out every payment from Arthur to Leo or Maria. They were meticulously documented at fair market rates for lawn care and transportation, often below what professional services would charge. There was no lump sum transfer, no secret bank accounts, no pattern of grooming through extravagant gifts. The money flow was transparent, modest, and consistent with a clear, arm's-length service arrangement for 3 years. Furthermore, Arthur's investment portfolio showed no unusual activity, no large withdrawals, no changed beneficiaries on accounts until the formal will was executed by the lawyer. Cruz then played his strongest card, the testimony of disinterested third parties. Arthur's oldest friend, a retired teacher named Harold, testified that Arthur spoke of Leo like a grandson with pure joy. He said Arthur had become more engaged, happier, since the young man came into his life. When asked about Mark and Diane, Harold paused and said carefully, Arthur loved them, but he missed them. The phone isn't the same as a presence. Arthur's longtime financial advisor testified that their meetings were always lucid, focused, and that Arthur himself had initiated the discussion about changing his estate plan. He said he wanted to reward active loyalty over passive lineage, the advisor recalled. He was very clear, very deliberate. But just as the case seemed to be tipping toward Leo, the children's lawyers unleashed their pivotal piece of evidence. It was a pivot that reframed everything. They had dug deeper into Maria Martinez's past. They discovered that 12 years prior, she had been named as a beneficiary in the will of another elderly woman she had cared for as a home health aide. That woman had also changed her will shortly before her death, leaving Maria a small but significant sum. That case had not been contested by the woman's distant family. In the courtroom, this revelation landed like a grenade. The implication was clear. This was not an isolated act of kindness. This was a pattern. Maria Martinez, they argued, had a history of forming close bonds with vulnerable elders and being remembered in their wills. She had then, they claimed, taught her son the same playbook. This wasn't just about Leo's friendship. This was about a mother-son strategy. They painted Maria not as a compassionate nurse's aide, but as a serial influencer who saw caring for the elderly as a business opportunity with a potential inheritance payout. The media, which had been following the case as a curious human interest story, now seized on this new angle. Headlines shifted from lonely widower leaves fortune to kind teen to elder care worker's son inherits millions. A coincidence? The courtroom of public opinion began to turn. The simple, heartwarming narrative was now stained with suspicion. Ben Cruz was blindsided. He argued vehemently that the previous inheritance was a genuine gift from a grateful client, uncontested because it was legitimate. He pointed out that Maria had cared for that woman for 5 years, and the bequest was a fraction of what Arthur had left. But the damage was done. The seed of a scheme had been planted in the mind of the judge and the public. The final witness of Act 2A was the court-appointed investigator. His report was a balanced, heavy document. He concluded that Arthur Bell likely did have the testamentary capacity to make a will. His medical evidence was too strong. However, he expressed serious concern about the appearance of influence. The combination of near-total physical dependence on Leo, the social isolation from family, whether chosen or engineered, was unclear, and now the mother's prior history created, in his words, a troubling constellation of factors that warrants judicial scrutiny. He recommended the case proceed to a full competency hearing where live witnesses could be cross-examined. Judge Voss agreed. The hearing was set for 6 weeks' time. On the courthouse steps, the two sides faced a scrum of reporters. Mark Bell, his jaw tight, said, "We just want the world to see what was done to our father. This was a calculated takeover of a vulnerable man's mind. Leo and Maria, flanked by Ben Cruz, said nothing, but Maria's face, pale and strained, showed the toll. They weren't just fighting for money anymore. Their reputation, their very integrity, was being dissected in public. As the lawyers packed their briefcases, a new ominous problem arose for Team Leo: the legal fees. Ben Cruz's bills were mounting into the tens of thousands. The estate, now frozen by the court, could not be touched to pay for his defense. Maria's modest savings were evaporating. They faced a dire choice: settle now, giving up a large portion of the inheritance to make the case go away, or risk financial ruin fighting a protracted battle against opponents with seemingly bottomless resources. The moral high ground was becoming a cliff edge. And in a locked file in the children's lawyer's office, a new subpoena was being drafted. Its target was Leo Martinez's college admissions file. The theory was simple: if Arthur Bell's glowing recommendation letter was written after Leo learned of the new will, it was proof of a reward. If it was written before, it was merely kindness. The timing, they believed, was the smoking gun that would prove the entire relationship was a transaction, not a bond. They were about to turn Leo's future against his past. The subpoena for Leo's college file was a masterstroke. It bypassed the murky emotional debate and went straight for a timestamp. The children's lawyers weren't just looking for a recommendation letter, they were looking for a calendar, a ledger of when kindness might have turned into calculation. If Arthur Bell wrote his effusive praise after he drafted the new will, the implication was clear. The inheritance was a pre-negotiated fee for services rendered, disguised as generosity. The very document meant to secure Leo's future was now a trap. When the file was produced, it contained a bombshell, but not the one Mark and Diane's team expected. Arthur's recommendation letter was dated 8 months before his visit to the lawyer to change his will. It spoke of Leo's integrity, his work ethic, his innate curiosity, qualities Arthur had observed over 2 years of friendship. There was no mention of money, of inheritance, of anything beyond a proud mentor advocating for a promising student. For a moment, Ben Cruz breathed a sigh of relief. This was evidence of a pure bond, uncontaminated by later events. But the lawyers for the Bell children were tenacious. They zeroed in on a different detail. The letter was submitted as part of Leo's application for a specific, highly competitive engineering scholarship, one that covered full tuition. In his deposition, Leo was asked a simple, devastating question: "Did you get the scholarship?" He had to admit he had not. The follow-up question was quieter, more insidious: "And when did you find out you were rejected?" The answer was 3 weeks before Arthur Bell walked into his lawyer's office. The new narrative clicked into place with an awful clarity for the opposition. The timeline, they argued, was the real story. Arthur sees a talented, deserving kid. He helps him, writes a letter, hopes to secure his future through education. That fails. Leo's dream of an affordable top-tier education evaporates. Then and only then does Arthur, feeling perhaps a renewed sense of responsibility or guilt or manipulated sympathy, decide to rewrite his will. The inheritance wasn't a reward for past kindness. It was Plan B, a consolation prize, orchestrated by a savvy teenager and his mother after their first plan fell through. It reframed the entire relationship as a series of escalating investments, not disinterested love. This interpretation hit Leo and Maria like a physical blow. Their attorney, Cruz, argued fiercely that this was speculative cynicism, that Arthur was a man of agency who could make multiple decisions for someone he cared about. But the psychological damage was done. The media, now fully invested in the legal drama, ran with the scholarship rejection, led to million-dollar Plan B angle. Online forums dissected Leo's character. Strangers accused Maria of coaching her son in a long con. The pressure, which had been legal and financial, now became deeply, personally vicious. It was at this lowest point that the "wait, it gets worse" moment arrived. It didn't come from a courtroom, it came from a bank. Ben Cruz received a formal notice. The law firm representing Mark and Diane had filed a lien against the Bell estate for their attorney's fees. This was a common, aggressive tactic, but buried in the notice was a shocking figure. Their legal bills already exceeded $400,000. The message was brutal and clear. They were willing to burn the estate down to ashes in legal costs to win. Even if Leo eventually prevailed, there might be nothing left to inherit but a mountain of debt tied to the property. Maria Martinez reached her breaking point. Sitting with Cruz in his office, she made a desperate proposal. She wanted to offer a settlement, give Mark and Diane half of everything, 2/3, whatever it took to stop the bleeding and the character assassination. She just wanted it to be over, for her son to have something left to build a life with, and for his name to be cleared. Cruz advised against it. Settling, he said, would be seen as an admission of guilt in the court of public opinion forever. It would validate every ugly accusation. But Maria, watching her son retreat into a shell of anxiety, was past caring about public opinion. Cruz reluctantly took the offer to the other side. The response was a study in cold victory. They didn't just reject the settlement, they mocked it. Through their attorneys, they stated their position had now hardened. They were no longer seeking a share. They were seeking the entire estate plus legal fees. They wanted the will invalidated completely, leaving Leo with nothing and Arthur Bell to be declared intestate, his assets flowing by default to his children. The war was now total. There would be no peace treaty, only surrender. Faced with financial annihilation and a seemingly vindictive opposition, Ben Cruz made a last, risky move. He petitioned Judge Voss for a swift hearing on the competency issue itself, arguing the family, delay tactics, and massive fee accrual were themselves a form of coercion against his client. He also filed a motion to have the children's attorneys' fees paid from their own potential share of the estate, not the estate as a whole, if they lost. It was a Hail Mary. Judge Voss, growing impatient with the case's expanding bitterness, agreed to fast-track the final competency hearing. But she also, in a surprising move, granted a pre-hearing request from the Bell children's lawyers. She would allow them to call a new expert witness, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in testamentary capacity and soft signs of undue influence. This expert had not treated Arthur Bell, but would offer an opinion based on all the records, the timelines, and the behavioral patterns. It was a dangerous wild card. The hearing began on a gray Monday morning. The courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was funereal. Mark and Diane sat stiffly, surrounded by their legal team. Leo and Maria, looking small and tired, sat with Ben Cruz. The first witness was the forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Alastair Vance. For an hour, he delivered a cool, clinical dismantling of Arthur Bell's autonomy. He spoke of dependency relationships, of isolation as a precursor to manipulation, of the natural vulnerability of grief. He pointed to the scholarship timeline as highly suggestive of a transactional pivot. He stopped short of declaring Arthur incompetent, but he painted a picture of a man whose free will was so encumbered by circumstance and engineered relationships that his final decision could not be considered truly his own. On cross-examination, Ben Cruz went on the attack. He forced Dr. Vance to admit he had never met Arthur Bell, that his analysis was based purely on documents provided by one side. He got him to concede that none of Arthur's treating physicians had ever diagnosed him with a condition that would destroy testamentary capacity. But the sophisticated, jargon-filled testimony had done its work. It had given scientific sheen to the children's narrative of theft. Then Cruz called his own witness. It was Harold, Arthur's old friend, but this time Cruz asked a different question. Harold, in all your conversations with Arthur about Leo, did Arthur ever express any worry, any fear, any sense that he was being pressured? Harold shook his head firmly. Never, not once. He was grateful. He said Leo made him feel useful again, like he still had something to teach. Then Cruz asked the crucial follow-up. Did Arthur ever express anger or disappointment toward his children? Harold shifted uncomfortably, looked at Mark and Diane. He was sad, Harold said quietly. He said he understood they were busy. But the last time I saw him, about a month before he passed, he said something I'll never forget. He said, Harold, love isn't a title you're born with. It's a record you build day by day, and some people stop making deposits. The words hung in the air. For the first time, the cold legal battle was pierced by the raw, human truth of Arthur Bell's loneliness. Diane Bell looked down at her hands. Mark's jaw tightened. The hearing stretched into a second day. The children's lawyers called a parade of witnesses to reiterate the isolation theory. The paper boy confirmed Leo usually collected the mail. A neighbor agreed she saw Leo at the house constantly. The narrative of a siege was reinforced brick by brick. Just before the close of proceedings, Ben Cruz requested permission to play one piece of evidence. It was a short, grainy video clip from Arthur Bell's own security camera, dated the afternoon he signed the will. The timestamp showed him returning home. The footage from his porch camera showed Arthur getting out of Leo's car, but then something unexpected happened. Arthur turned back, said something to Leo in the driver's seat. Leo shook his head, smiling. Arthur then reached into his wallet, pulled out some cash, and handed it through the window. Leo took it, nodded, and drove off. It was a payment for the drive to the lawyer, a mundane, transactional end to a supposedly monumental, manipulative day. Cruz paused the video. "This is the moment," he told the judge, immediately after executing the will that supposedly crowns a years-long scheme of manipulation. And what do we see? A fare for a ride, a clear, documented, ordinary payment for a service, not a celebration, not a secret handshake, business as usual. This is not the behavior of a conspirator. This is the behavior of a young man doing his job and an old man maintaining his dignity and independence until the very end. The hearing adjourned. Judge Voss announced she would take the matter under advisement. A ruling would come in writing, likely within 2 weeks. The fate of $3 million and the legacy of Arthur Bell now rested on one person's interpretation of loyalty, law, and the human heart. As everyone filed out, drained, something quiet and profound happened in the hallway. Diane Bell, separated from her lawyers for a moment, found herself standing near Maria Martinez. They didn't speak, but Diane looked at Maria, at the deep weariness in her eyes, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the wronged heiress slipped. In its place was something haunted, something that looked like doubt. She had just spent days listening to her father be described as a weakened, manipulated fool. She had won the legal narrative, but she may have begun to sense the cost, forever memorializing her father not as a man of decisive love, but as a pathetic victim. She turned and walked quickly away. The final beat of Act 2 belonged to Leo. Outside the courthouse, a reporter shoved a microphone in his face and asked, "Do you still think you deserve the money?" Leo, who had been silent throughout, looked at the camera. His voice was quiet but clear. "It was never about the money, it was about him, and now you've all made it about everything but him." He walked away, leaving the swirling media storm behind, stepping not toward a victory or a loss, but into the grim silence of waiting for a verdict that would define his future and judge a dead man's mind. For 14 days, there was only silence. Then, the ruling from Judge Margaret Voss arrived, not with a courtroom bang, but as a dense, 23-page PDF emailed to the attorneys at close of business on a Tuesday. The first page contained her conclusion. She had found in favor of the petitioner, Leonardo Martinez. The will was valid. Arthur Bell had testamentary capacity. The document was a masterpiece of judicial reasoning that dissected the case with surgical precision. Judge Voss began by dismantling the medical argument. She cited the clean cognitive exams, the treating physicians, consistent testimony, and dismissed the single forgetful note as anecdotal, not diagnostic. "Advanced age and physical frailty," she wrote, "are not synonymous with mental incapacity. To assume otherwise is a prejudice." Then she addressed the heart of the matter, undue influence. She acknowledged the troubling constellation, the dependence, the isolation, the mother's history, but then she meticulously contrasted it with the evidence, the modest, documented payments, the security footage showing mundane transactions after the will signing, the timeline of the recommendation letter, which she called evidence of pre-existing esteem, not a later quid pro quo. Her most devastating passage was about the children's own behavior. The petitioners argue that the respondent isolated the decedent, yet the record is replete with evidence that the decedent's biological children isolated themselves through physical absence and transactional communication. The court cannot find that a third party created a void they did not first find and consistently choose not to fill. She saved her sharpest language for the scholarship theory. The suggestion that the decedent's beneficence was merely Plan B is not only unsupported by evidence, but insulting to the autonomy of a competent adult. It presumes that older adults are incapable of complex, layered motivations, of wishing to help a young person both through educational opportunity and, if that fails, through legacy. This court rejects such a diminished view of human agency. Finally, she ruled on the attorney's fees. She denied the lien against the estate. The children's legal fees, now approaching $500,000, were their own responsibility. The estate would pay the administrative costs and Ben Cruz's fees, which were a fraction of the other side. Arthur Bell's fortune would pass to Leo, largely intact. When Ben Cruz called Leo with the news, there was no shouting, no celebration. There was a long pause, then a shaky breath. "Okay," was all Leo said. For Maria, the relief was immediately followed by a wave of exhaustion so profound she had to sit down. The weight of the accusation, the public scrutiny, lifted just enough to let her feel how heavy it had truly been. For Mark and Diane, the ruling was a brutal repudiation. Their lawyer read them the key sections over a conference call. Diane began to cry, not the performative tears of the deposition, but deep, shuddering sobs of loss that now had two layers: the loss of her father and the loss of the narrative that had justified her distance. Mark sat in stunned silence. They had not just lost the estate, they had lost the argument about their father's love. The court had officially recorded that their absence had meaning. The media cycle moved on, its attention grabbed by the next scandal. The public, which had been split, largely accepted the judge's verdict as the final word. The story was filed away as a cautionary tale about neglecting elderly parents. The estate was settled. After taxes and legal fees, Leo Martinez came into an inheritance of just under $2.8 million. He and his mother did something quietly telling. They paid off their modest mortgage. Maria reduced her work hours. Leo transferred to a state university with a strong engineering program, not the distant private school of his dreams, but one where he could be close to home. The grand, life-altering wealth was deliberately folded into a quiet, secure, normal life. But the story had one final, surprising detail, a twist that came not from the courtroom, but from Arthur Bell's own hand. During the process of emptying the Maple Crest Lane house for sale, Leo found a sealed envelope taped to the bottom of the old metal toolbox in the garage, the one Arthur had let him use. It was addressed to Leo, in Arthur's precise handwriting. Inside was a short letter, dated the same week he had signed the will. Leo *. If you're reading this, the lawyers are probably done arguing about me. Don't let their noise drown out the signal. This money isn't a payment. You were paid fairly for every lawn you mowed and every drive you gave. This is something else. It's an investment in a character I've had the privilege to witness. I know my children will call this a betrayal, but a parent's duty isn't to give you what you want. It's to give you what you need. They needed a reminder about the currency of time. You needed a foundation. This is me balancing the books. Use it to build a life of substance, not just stuff. Help your mother, study hard, be present for the people you love. That's the only dividend I'm interested in. It was an honor to be your friend, *. Arthur. The letter was never entered into evidence. Leo and Maria showed it to no one. It was their private vindication, the whispered postscript from beyond the grave that confirmed everything they had felt but could never prove in court, that Arthur Bell knew exactly what he was doing and why. The house on Maple Crest Lane sold to a young family. Mark and Diane, after paying their monumental legal bills, severed contact with the neighborhood and each other, the shared grievance now replaced by a shared, unspoken shame. The rift between them never healed. Leo Martinez graduated with his engineering degree, debt-free. He used a portion of the inheritance to start a small scholarship fund at his high school for students pursuing trades or technology, with a preference for those who showed consistent community commitment. The award was modest, but it carried Arthur Bell's name. The final image of this story is not of a courtroom or a bank vault. It's a simple one occurring every Sunday. Leo drives to his mother's house. They cook dinner together in her now paid-for kitchen. The conversation is easy. The silence is comfortable. There is no score being kept, no ledger of obligation. It is simply what they do. It is, in its own quiet way, the ultimate execution of Arthur Bell's will, not the document filed with the court, but the intention behind it. A legacy of loyalty, lived out in ordinary time. The legal question was answered. Arthur Bell was competent. The human question lingers: what do we owe each other? The system declared that a man has the right to reward presence over pedigree, and in a quiet kitchen every Sunday, that right is quietly, peacefully honored. So what does the story of Arthur Bell leave us with? It's more than a legal precedent about testamentary capacity. It's a stark ledger of emotional accounting. The court ruled on paper, but the real judgment happened long before in the quiet moments of choice. The choice to call, to visit, to show up, or to assume that blood is a bond that requires no maintenance. Arthur Bell's final act forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What do we truly inherit and what do we earn? We inherit a name, a genetic line, a history, but we earn trust, we earn loyalty, we earn a place in someone's will, or more importantly, in their heart, through the daily deposits of time, attention, and presence. The law, in this case, sided with the earned over the inherited. It declared that a person of sound mind has the sovereign right to decide where their life's work goes, and that their definition of family is not limited by biology. But this story also serves as a warning about the shadows that gather when an elder is left in silence. The system is right to be vigilant against undue influence, because real exploitation is a vicious crime. Yet in protecting the vulnerable, we must be careful not to infantilize the independent. Not every close relationship with a caregiver is a conspiracy. Sometimes, it is simply the human response to loneliness, the beautiful, random flowering of a bond that fills a void others left empty. The tragedy for Mark and Diane was not just the loss of money, it was the loss of their own narrative. They went to court to prove their father was manipulated, and in doing so, they had his love for them officially catalogued as a secondary concern. They won the battle of public sympathy, but lost the war for their father's posthumous respect. Their story is a cautionary tale that neglect has its own compound interest, and the bill often comes due in ways we never expect. For Leo and Maria, the inheritance was never the point. The point was the friendship, the respect, the simple human decency they offered without an eye on a future payoff. The money was Arthur's final, grand gesture of thanks, but the real gift was the 3 years of companionship that preceded it. They understood, as Arthur did, that the most valuable currency isn't dollars, but hours, and that the richest legacy isn't what you're given, but what you build with someone. These stories matter because they hold up a mirror. They ask us to look at our own relationships, our own ledgers. Who are we showing up for? Who have we forgotten? Are we building connections that are transactional, or are we building them on a foundation of genuine, uncalculated care? If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the quiet contracts of love and loyalty in your own life, then do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to us, and it ensures you won't miss the next deep dive into the real, raw stories that define us. Leave a comment below and tell us, in the end, what do you think is the true inheritance we leave behind? The money or the memory of how we made people feel?